$5. Just $5. To most, it's nothing, a forgettable sum. The kind of money that slips between couch cushions or vanishes without a second thought. But for her, it was everything. It was the last tether to survival, the final bridge between hope and oblivion. A crumpled bill, worn from countless desperate hands before hers, now clutched between her trembling fingers as though it held the weight of the world. Her stomach clenched in agony, the sharp pains a cruel reminder that hunger did not pity the weak. She had grown used to the ache, the hollow emptiness gnawing at her ribs like a restless beast. Hunger had a voice. It whispered in the quiet, screamed in the night, taunted her every waking moment. And yet, she had learned to silence it, to press a hand to her stomach and pretend that emptiness was nothing more than a passing shadow. The wind howled through the city streets, seeping through the threadbare fabric of her coat. It was an unforgiving kind of cold, the kind that settled deep into the bones, that turned fingers numb and lips blue. She curled into herself, trying to disappear, trying to make her body smaller, as though that could shield her from the biting frost. The streets pulsed with life around her, people moving in hurried steps, lost in their own worlds wrapped in warmth, laughter, and certainty. She was invisible to them, just another forgotten soul blending into the background of a city that never stopped to notice. But she noticed. She noticed everything, the scent of fresh bread wafting from a nearby bakery, a cruel reminder of what she couldn't have. The jingling of coins as a businessman slipped change into his pocket without a second glance. The sound of a mother scolding her child for wanting too many sweets, the child pouting, arms crossed. Oh, how easy it was to take abundance for granted. She looked down at the $5 bill again, her fingers tightening around it. This was it. This was all she had. There was no hidden stash, no secret reserve, no lifeline waiting beyond the next hour. This was it. She could buy a meal, just one. Enough to quiet the hunger for a little while, to grant her a brief moment of warmth before the cold returned to claim her again. It wouldn't last, but wasn't that better than nothing? Or she could hold on to it, stretch it as far as it could go. But how far could $5 really take her? Another night, maybe two, before reality closed in again, before the weight of existence crushed whatever was left of her resolve. Her mind waged war against itself. Survive, give, survive, give. It was a simple choice, wasn't it? And yet it wasn't. Because once she let go of that $5, she would have nothing, nothing. No safety net, no way back. And then she saw him. A boy, young, maybe 9, maybe 10. His clothes were torn at the edges, his shoes scuffed beyond recognition. He stood near a street vendor, staring, not at the man, but at the food. His small hands were tucked into his sleeves, his body shivering against the cold. And his eyes, oh, his eyes. They were hollow, the kind of emptiness that shouldn't exist in someone so young. She knew that hunger. She knew that cold. She knew what it felt like to stand in a world where everyone else had something, and you had nothing. Her fingers tightened around the bill, her heartbeat pounding against her ribs. Number. She couldn't. She couldn't give away the only thing she had left. She couldn't. And then he looked at her, just for a second, a glance, a fleeting, desperate, silent plea. And in that moment, something inside her shattered. Her body moved before her mind could stop it, before she could think, before she could reconsider, before she could hold on to the fear that had gripped her so tightly. One step, then another, and then she placed the crumpled bill in his tiny frozen hands. He looked up at her, his lips parting, his eyes widening, as though he couldn't believe what had just happened. He tried to speak, but no words came out. None were needed. She smiled, just barely. And then she turned away, walking in the opposite direction, before she could change her mind, before she could feel the weight of what she had just done. She had nothing now, nothing. And yet as she walked away, she felt something strange, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not safety, not warmth, not relief, but something different. Then the storm came. Not the kind that filled the sky with thunder and rain, but the kind that would change everything. A storm of fate, of consequence, of events she never could have foreseen. Because what happened next was impossible. And it all began with $5. Lisa wasn't always like this. Once, she had a life filled with laughter, with warmth, with certainty. A world where love surrounded her, where the simple act of waking up in the morning didn't feel like a battle. A world where she wasn't invisible. But life has a way of stripping people down, piece by piece, until all that's left is the raw, aching truth. Nothing is ever truly secure. Not happiness, not love, not even the ground beneath your feet. Her world unraveled so fast that even now she struggled to grasp how it all happened. She had a family once, a husband who adored her, a daughter who was the light of their lives. Their home was small, but it was enough. It was warm, it was safe, it was theirs. Evenings were spent around the dinner table, her daughter's laughter echoing through the house. Her husband, James, was the kind of man who made even the worst days bearable. "Whatever happens," he would say, "we face it together." And Lisa believed him. But fate doesn't make promises, it intends to keep. It started with a cough, just a simple cough. "Probably just a cold," James had said, waving off her concern. But the cough didn't go away. It grew worse. It turned into something deep, something that rattled inside him like a ticking clock. The hospital was supposed to provide answers, but instead it handed them something else, a nightmare. Lisa still remembered the way the doctor's voice sounded, calm, measured, rehearsed. "It's serious," he had said. "We'll need to run more tests." She didn't need tests to tell her what she already knew. She could see it in James's eyes, in the way his hands shook when he reached for hers. The fear, the quiet, creeping terror that neither of them wanted to name. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The hospital visits became more frequent. The medical bills piled up like an avalanche, threatening to bury them alive. And then, the worst came. One evening, as Lisa stood at the kitchen sink washing dishes, she heard it, a thud, the sound of something heavy hitting the floor. She turned, heart pounding. James lay on the ground, motionless. For a moment, time stood still. Then, everything moved too fast. Her hands shaking as she dialed 911. The wail of the ambulance, the fluorescent glow of the hospital lights. The doctors speaking in low, hurried voices. Machines beeping. Her daughter crying. And then silence. James was gone. Grief is a strange thing. It doesn't just break you, it unravels you, bit by bit, until you're no longer sure where you begin or where the pain ends. Lisa tried to hold on, for her daughter, for herself, but the weight of everything was too much. The bills didn't stop just because her world had. At first she tried. She really tried. She worked long hours, took on extra shifts, fought to keep the life they had built. But grief is exhausting. It makes you slow. It makes you weak. And the world does not wait for the weak. The job slipped through her fingers, then the house, then the security she had fought so hard to protect. The eviction notice came on a Monday. She remembered that because Mondays were always the hardest. It was just a piece of paper, but to her, it was the end. She packed what little they had left. Clothes, photographs, anything that could fit into a few bags. But some things couldn't be carried. Some things were lost the moment they walked out that door. Her daughter was taken in by her grandmother. "Just for a while," they said, "until you get back on your feet." But Lisa knew the truth. She wasn't getting back on her feet. Not anytime soon. Maybe not ever. And just like that, she was alone. The days blurred together after that. The cold, the hunger, the endless search for something, anything to hold on to. She had nothing left, nothing but $5. That was all that remained of the life she once knew. A single crumpled bill tucked inside a purse that had seen better days. $5 to her name? A number so small, so insignificant. And yet, in this world it meant the difference between survival and surrender. She sat on a bench, her fingers tightening around the bill, her stomach twisting with hunger. $5, that was it. And then she saw the boy. That moment, that split-second choice, would change everything. Lisa walked with her head down, gripping the $5 bill so tightly that the edges curled beneath the pressure of her fingers. It was a small thing, light as air, insignificant to most. But to her, it was survival. Her stomach coiled in protest, twisting and wringing itself like a dry rag, reminding her of what she already knew. She needed to eat. She moved through the crowded streets, the scent of food clinging to the air, cruel and taunting. The golden warmth of freshly baked bread, the sizzling of meat on an open grill, the crackle of oil as something crisp and delicious was lifted from the fryer. Her mouth watered despite herself, the hunger making her dizzy, her body sluggish. 2 days, 2 full days without food. It felt longer. It felt like forever. Ahead, a street vendor handed a man his meal. A steaming plate piled high with rice, vegetables glistening with sauce, a slice of thick, buttered bread resting at the side. Lisa's grip on the bill tightened. $5. It wouldn't buy her much, but it would be enough. Enough to make the gnawing hunger ease, even if only for a little while. Enough to make the world feel just a little less cruel. But then, she saw him, or rather, she felt him. He was standing near the vendor's cart, barely moving, just a small, quiet presence in the sea of rushing people. His clothes were ragged, torn at the edges, hanging from his frame like they had belonged to someone bigger. His feet, bare and cracked, stood on the freezing pavement, shifting from side to side as if trying to find a warmth that didn't exist. His face was hollow, his eyes locked on the steaming plates of food being passed from hand to hand. He wasn't begging. He wasn't even speaking. Just standing there looking. Lisa's breath caught in her throat. Something about him, about the way he stood there in silence, made her chest tighten. Maybe it was the way his hands were shoved under his arms, desperately trying to preserve the little warmth he had. Maybe it was the way his lips were slightly parted, as if he were tasting the food in the air, imagining what it would feel like to have even one bite. Or maybe it was his eyes. She knew that look. Hunger had a way of making people look the same. It hollowed out their faces, dulled the light in their eyes. She had seen it before, in her reflection, in the mirror of store windows she passed, in the puddles on the street when she glanced down. It was a look that she had tried to ignore for days now, a look that told a story of desperation, of endless nights spent listening to the sound of her own body breaking itself down, trying to find something, anything to sustain itself. She took a slow, trembling breath and looked down at the $5 bill. She could still feel the warmth of the food cart just a few steps away. She could already imagine what it would feel like. The first bite, the way her stomach would finally stop twisting itself into painful knots. The momentary relief. She could eat. She could make it through one more day. Or, Lisa's fingers flexed, the bill crinkling slightly as she looked back at the boy. He wasn't watching her. He was still staring at the food, still locked in his own quiet suffering. She had nothing, nothing but $5. Nothing but a hunger that had become so familiar it felt like part of her. But he had even less. Her heartbeat pounded against her ribs as she hesitated, her mind racing with the weight of the decision. Her survival depended on that money. But so did his. Her chest ached as she took one step forward, and then another. Before she could stop herself, before the fear of her own situation could creep back in, before she could remind herself that she was just as lost, just as hungry, she reached out. The boy flinched slightly as she slipped the bill into his small, frozen hands. His fingers curled around it instinctively, as if he wasn't sure it was real. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then, slowly, he looked up at her. His eyes widened. Lisa swallowed past the lump forming in her throat. She gave him a small, uncertain smile, but she couldn't find any words. What could she say? That she understood. That she knew what it felt like to be forgotten, to feel like nothing more than a ghost passing through a world that didn't see you. That she had just given away the last thing she had, and now she had nothing. No words came. The boy's lips parted, as if he wanted to say something, but all that came out was a shaky breath. His eyes were still wide, still filled with something Lisa couldn't quite name. Gratitude? Shock? She didn't wait for him to speak. Before she could change her mind, before she could feel the weight of what she had just done, before she could let the hunger in her own stomach remind her of what she had just given away, she turned. She walked. Each step felt heavier than the last. Her hands slipped into the pockets of her coat, but there was nothing left to hold. The air felt colder. The hunger gnawed harder. The city around her moved as if nothing had happened, as if she had not just given away the last thing that tethered her to survival. And for the first time since losing everything, she felt something she hadn't felt before. Fear. True, raw, absolute fear. Because now, she had nothing. No food, no money, no safety. She had just given away the only thing standing between her and the abyss of complete and utter destitution. Was this a mistake? Had she just doomed herself? She closed her eyes as she walked, forcing herself to breathe past the fear. She had made her choice, and now she would have to live with it, or die with it. Because now, there was no turning back. And somewhere behind her, the boy still stood, still holding the crumpled $5 bill, still staring at the woman who had just given away the last thing she had in the world. He didn't know it yet. Neither did she. But that single moment, those few seconds of hesitation, of decision, of action, had just changed everything. Because what happened next was impossible. That night, the city was merciless. Lisa sat curled against the rough brick of an alleyway, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as the cold seeped through the thin fabric of her coat. Her body trembled, not just from the freezing air, but from exhaustion, from hunger, from the overwhelming weight of nothingness. She had felt hunger before. She had known cold, but never like this. Never this deep, this absolute. Her stomach twisted violently, the gnawing emptiness sharper than ever. Her head felt light, as though she were floating between consciousness and something else, something darker, heavier. Her fingers, stiff and numb, clutched at her sleeves, rubbing the fabric in a weak attempt to summon warmth that refused to come. It was useless. The cold was inside her now, winding its way through her veins, curling up beneath her skin, whispering in a cruel, taunting voice, "This is it. This is the end." The rain started as a slow drizzle, light and almost delicate, but it didn't stay that way for long. Within minutes, it turned relentless, pounding against the pavement, soaking into the fabric of her clothes. Water dripped from her hair, clung to her lashes, slid down her face in streams that blurred into the silent tears she had stopped trying to fight. She lifted her face to the sky, eyes burning as the rain mixed with salt, with grief, with something that felt dangerously close to regret. Why? The question echoed through the empty spaces inside her. Why did I do it? Why had she given away her last $5? Why had she looked at that boy and decided in an instant that his hunger mattered more than hers? Why had she chosen kindness over survival? And was it even worth it? What had it changed? Nothing. She was still here, still starving, still drenched, still freezing, still pressed against a wall in a city that did not care whether she lived or died. For a brief moment, a dangerous thought entered her mind. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe kindness was a luxury. Maybe giving when you had nothing wasn't noble. It was foolish. Maybe, in a world like this, people like her didn't get to be good. Maybe goodness was for people who had the privilege of knowing they'd wake up in a warm bed tomorrow. The thought made her chest ache in a way that had nothing to do with hunger. She pressed her forehead against her knees, willing herself to disappear. The city moved on without her. Footsteps echoed down the alley as people passed, their hurried conversations nothing more than background noise. No one looked. No one noticed. She was just another ghost, fading into the spaces between their lives. She had once been seen. She had once mattered. But that was another lifetime. That was when she still had James. When she still had her daughter's tiny hand in hers. When she had a home, a name, a future. Now, she was just another nameless shadow in the dark. The rain grew heavier, falling in thick sheets, washing away the last of her warmth. Her breath came in slow, shaky exhales, misting in the night air. She didn't know how much longer she could do this. Her body felt tired, not just from the cold, not just from hunger, but from existing, from waking up every morning knowing that nothing would change, that there was no way out of this. Maybe she should have kept the $5. Maybe she should have thought of herself first, just this once. Or maybe it didn't matter anymore. She closed her eyes, sinking deeper into herself, trying to block out the cold, the rain, the ache in her bones. And then, a sound, faint, software almost lost beneath the storm. Footsteps, slow, hesitant, then a voice, small, uncertain. Miss. Her eyes fluttered open. For a moment she thought she had imagined it. Then, through the blur of rain and exhaustion, she saw him, the boy, the same boy she had given her last $5 to. He stood just a few feet away, soaked from the rain, his small shoulders trembling. He was still clutching something in his hands. She blinked, her mind struggling to understand. What was he doing here? Why hadn't he left? Why had he come back? Her throat tightened, her voice barely a whisper. What are you doing here? The boy took a small step forward, hesitant but determined. He opened his hands, and in them, a sandwich, wrapped in paper, still warm. Her breath caught in her throat. I got food, the boy said quietly. And I wanted to share it with you. For a moment, Lisa couldn't move, couldn't speak. The boy extended the sandwich toward her, his small hands shaking from the cold. You gave me your last money, he whispered. So, I thought you might be hungry too. Lisa's chest ached in a way that had nothing to do with hunger. Her fingers reached out, hesitant, shaking, as she took the sandwich from his hands. It was small, simple, nothing extravagant, but to her, it was everything. A lump formed in her throat, thick and heavy, making it impossible to speak. She looked at the boy, at the quiet sincerity in his gaze, at the kindness shining through the hunger, through the hardship. Kindness, the very thing she had begun to doubt. And yet, here it was, returning to her. Her fingers clenched around the warm paper as she exhaled shakily. "Thank you," she whispered. The boy just nodded. Then, for the first time in what felt like forever, Lisa took a bite. The warmth spread through her instantly, filling the emptiness inside her, quieting the hunger just enough to remind her that she was still alive, that she could still feel, that maybe, just maybe, kindness wasn't a mistake. Maybe it had saved her, and maybe it was about to change everything. Lisa sat with the boy in the cold silence of the alley, the sandwich in her hands, half-eaten, but already more satisfying than any meal she could remember. It wasn't just the food. It was what it meant. Someone had noticed her. Someone had cared. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she wasn't invisible. The boy sat beside her, his legs drawn up to his chest, his small fingers rubbing against his arms as he tried to keep warm. He didn't say much. He didn't have to. They sat there together, two souls forgotten by the world, but not by each other. At some point, exhaustion took over. Lisa's body, weak from days of hunger and cold, finally gave in. Her eyes fluttered closed, and the world around her blurred. The rain had slowed, turning into a soft mist that settled over the streets like a weary sigh. She didn't fight sleep when it came. And then, a touch, light, hesitant, fingertips on her shoulder. Her eyes snapped open, her pulse jolting her awake. At first, all she saw was the same dim alleyway, the rain-slick pavement glistening under the weak glow of a street lamp. The night was still, hushed, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Then, a voice. Miss, are you okay?" The words were soft, careful, spoken in a tone that was neither pitying nor indifferent. Her gaze lifted. The boy stood in front of her again, but this time, he wasn't alone. Behind him, a man stood, tall, well-dressed. His coat looked expensive, his shoes polished, his posture upright in a way that only those untouched by hardship carried themselves. But his expression was something else. Lisa stiffened instinctively, unsure, caught between fear and confusion. People like him didn't talk to people like her. They looked past her, through her, never stopping to acknowledge that she even existed. But this man was looking at her, really looking. The boy took a step closer, his small face breaking into a hesitant smile. "This is my dad," he said softly. Lisa's breath caught. "I told him what you did for me." The man exhaled slowly, his gaze never leaving Lisa's. There was something searching in his eyes, something she couldn't quite name. Then he reached into his coat pocket. Lisa's body tensed out of instinct, years of hardship preparing her for anything. But what he pulled out wasn't a badge or a threat. It was an envelope. He extended it toward her, his fingers steady, his expression unreadable. Lisa just stared. A slow beat of silence stretched between them. The rain had stopped completely now, leaving the air thick with something unspoken. She looked at the envelope, then back at the man. "Take it," he said. His voice was deep, smooth, but there was something else in it, something she couldn't place. Lisa hesitated. She had seen enough in this world to know that kindness often came with a price, that nothing was truly given without expectation. "Why?" The man's lips pressed together. He glanced at the boy, his son, who was still watching the exchange with an expression of quiet understanding, as if he already knew what his father was going to say. When the man spoke again, his voice was softer. "Because you didn't hesitate," Lisa swallowed, her throat dry. "What?" "You gave him your last $5. You had nothing, and still. You gave..." Lisa's chest tightened, something raw and unfamiliar swelling in her ribs. The man took a step closer, pressing the envelope into her hands. "People don't do that anymore," he said. "They turn away. They pretend not to see, but You didn't. Lisa's fingers curled around the envelope, her pulse hammering. The weight of it was wrong. Too heavy, too full. A sudden, terrifying thought gripped her. I can't open it. Her breath stilled. Her fingers trembled as she peeled back the flap, her heartbeat thudding in her ears. The envelope fell open, and inside, money. Thick stacks of bills, crisp, neat, too much. Her vision blurred. Her hands shook so violently that she nearly dropped it. No, this couldn't be real. This had to be some kind of cruel trick. She looked up at him, desperate for an explanation. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. The man exhaled through his nose, watching her carefully. $5,000, the world tilted. Lisa's breath hitched. What? I was like you once. The words hit her harder than the money in her hands. She blinked, struggling to focus. The man's gaze drifted downward, his hands slipping into the pockets of his expensive coat, his shoulders heavy with something invisible. A long time ago, I was hungry too. I know what it's like to have nothing, to feel like the world has already decided what you're worth. Lisa's hands clenched around the envelope. But then, someone helped me. A stranger. Someone who didn't owe me anything, who didn't even know my name. They gave me a second chance when no one else would. His eyes met hers again. Tonight, that person was you. Lisa's throat burned, but she had no words. The boy tugged at his father's sleeve, his small face beaming. "She's nice, Dad," he said softly. "I knew you'd want to help her." The man let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head slightly. "Yeah," he murmured. "Yeah, I did." Lisa's entire body felt too light and too heavy all at once. This didn't happen. This wasn't real, and yet the money in her hands was real. The boy's warm smile was real. The chance was real. Her chest rose and fell in unsteady breaths, her heart pounding in a way she hadn't felt in years. She could eat. She could sleep in a bed tonight. She could, for the first time in forever, she could hope. Tears burned behind her eyes, hot and relentless. The words slipped past her lips before she could stop them. "I don't know what to say." The man's lips quirked, in something that wasn't quite a smile. "Then don't say anything." Lisa's fingers curled around the envelope, holding it to her chest as if it might vanish if she let go. She had spent so long thinking she had nothing left to give. That kindness was weakness. That hope was just another word for disappointment. But now she wasn't so sure. The boy tugged on his father's sleeve again. "Can we take her to get food, Dad?" Lisa let out a choked laugh, her shoulders trembling. The man smiled, nodding. "Yeah," he said. "I think we can do that." And as they walked away from the alley together, Lisa realized something. She had given away her last $5, and in return, she had gained something far greater: hope. Lisa stood at the threshold of her new life, staring at the key in her trembling hand. It was small, unremarkable, just a simple piece of metal. And yet it was the heaviest thing she had ever held. She exhaled, her breath shaky, her heart hammering against her ribs. For the first time in years, she wasn't stepping into another cold, endless night. She wasn't curling into herself on a rain-drenched sidewalk or gripping her coat tighter against a wind that never stopped biting. This time, she had a door, and beyond it, a place to belong. Her fingers curled around the key, her pulse quickening as she turned it in the lock. A soft click. The door swung open. The apartment was small, modest. The furniture was secondhand, the walls bare, the kitchen nothing more than a few cabinets and a simple stove. But to Lisa, it was a palace. A real bed, a table, a window that looked out over the city. She took a hesitant step inside, as if the walls themselves might reject her. as if this was some fragile illusion that could disappear at any moment. But it didn't. It was real. She was inside. She was safe. She was home. Her knees nearly buckled beneath her. She pressed a hand against the wall, grounding herself, forcing back the sudden wave of emotions threatening to consume her. Everything had changed, and it all began with a choice. A choice that, in the moment, had seemed so small, so insignificant. A choice that nearly broke her. She had given her last $5 to a hungry boy on the street, and in return, she had been given everything. Her fingers brushed over the worn fabric of her coat, a habit she had developed in the hardest of times, feeling for the things she used to carry. Loose change, old receipts, scraps of paper she had convinced herself might be useful someday. But there was nothing there now, because she wasn't there anymore. She had left that life behind, a new beginning, a second chance. She had been given a job, nothing extravagant, nothing glamorous, but honest work, a steady paycheck, the chance to build. She had been given a home, not just a place to sleep, but a space where she could breathe. She had been given hope. Lisa moved to the window, staring out at the world that had once swallowed her whole. She had been at rock bottom. She had lost everything, and yet, here she was, whole, standing, alive. Her mind drifted back to the boy, the one who had changed everything, the one who had shown her that kindness wasn't a weakness, that hope wasn't a lie, that no matter how much the world tried to tell her she was nothing, she still had something left to give. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She turned, hesitant, as if some part of her still believed she would wake up on the street, that this was all just a cruel dream. But when she opened the door, there he was, the boy. His small face lit up the moment he saw her. Lisa barely had time to process before he threw his arms around her, burying his face against her coat. A sharp, unexpected breath escaped her lips. Slowly, carefully, she wrapped her arms around him. He was warm. She closed her eyes, holding him tight, pressing her forehead against the top of his head. "Thank you," he whispered. Her throat tightened. "No," she whispered back. "Thank you." Because in that moment she realized something. It wasn't the money. It wasn't the apartment. It wasn't even the job. It was this. It was humanity. It was the simple, undeniable truth that in a world that had tried so hard to break her, to convince her that kindness was worthless, that she was worthless, one small act of goodness had proven otherwise. Lisa pulled back just enough to look at the boy, brushing a strand of hair from his face. "You saved me too," she said. And for the first time in years, she smiled, not just with her lips, but with her soul. Because in the end, kindness had come back to her in the most unexpected way, and it proved no act of kindness ever goes unrewarded.
Would you have given your last $5? Would you have chosen kindness, even when you had nothing left to give? Or would fear have won? Would doubt have made you hold on just a little longer, believing that survival meant keeping, not giving? It's easy to say what we think we would do, but when faced with a moment like Lisa's, when the weight of hunger, exhaustion, and hopelessness presses down on your shoulders, when the world has stripped everything away, who would you become? Would you still believe in goodness? Would you still believe in hope? Tonight, somewhere in the world, someone is standing exactly where Lisa stood, cold, hungry, forgotten, and someone else is walking past them. What if, right now, you are someone's miracle waiting to happen? What if one act of kindness could change everything? Lisa's story isn't just a story, it's a question, and now, it's your turn to answer. Tell us in the comments, would you have given your last $5? Would you have walked away, or would you have done what Lisa did? And if this story moved you, if it made you think, if it made you feel, then don't let it end here. Let's share kindness. Let's share hope. Hit that like button if you believe in the power of compassion. Subscribe to Rare Tales Unfold so you never miss another story that stirs the soul. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, someone who needs a reminder that good still exists, share this video, because no act of kindness ever goes unrewarded.